Alright, you guys, so after seeing the ban list, instead of like doing a reaction, pretending like I didn't see it and pretending like I'm surprised, I decided to actually just do a top 10. The top 10 current best decks post ban list. And I'll talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses and why I feel there are going to be decks on this list that you guys probably haven't seen for a while. But there's reasonings, like I have very good reasons behind why I believe these decks are going to be seen now. Because also keep in mind that sometimes a deck is popular just for the simple fact that it's really good against what is good right now. And when what is good right now becomes less popular or underrepresented, where it's not like all over the place, like you're just not running into it, like where it's not like the second most represented deck or the most represented deck, certain decks that are good against those become less favorable because they had very specific counters, and in that particular matchup, they had a strength that they don't have in every matchup. So there are some decks that are on this list that fall into that category where they're good right now, but they might not always be good, but they're good right now because of what I know and what I believe personally is going to be popular. This is speculation, and it's also, I like to go really big. For me, what makes a deck really good is representation. The actual play style of the deck, meaning like how it interacts all across the playing field, like its matchups. Like I think matchups probably is the second most important thing. Representation slash tops slash notoriety slash popularity. That is like one of the biggest things. A deck can literally be the best deck just because a lot of people play it. It doesn't even have to be literally the best deck, if that makes sense. Like Zoodiacs could be the best deck just because everybody plays it, right? And you can't really speculate any further and say, oh, this deck's the best deck, because what you see is what you get. So if all you're seeing is Zoo, people will automatically, and this is, I'm just speaking in like a generic term, like a lot of people will just say, okay, this deck's the best deck. But with that in mind, like knowing that mindset that a lot of people feel like, okay, representation, I feel like the second most important thing is matchups. What makes a deck good is how good it is against what is good right now. So when we get into this list, keep that. Don't forget about that. Because there are some decks that you're going to see and you'll be like, why is this deck good? Because it's so good against what is good right now. And that's where it's like, that's a lot of where Yu-Gi-Oh comes from. Okay, so like anybody that was let down by the ban list, keep your head up, bro. Just don't complain all the time. Like, to be honest, just take what you can get. Appreciate that some of the problem cards are out of the format. And also, you know, to be honest, like, if you don't want to play the game, just don't play it, you know? But moving forward, if you want to play this game, you have to take your L's like a man and also accept any opportunity that you can get a W. And this ban list, for me, it was a little bit of a W. I look more for what comes off versus what's going to get banned. It was a little bit of a W for me. And any L that I would have taken, it's fine, because at the end of the day, like, you don't have control over everything, and you can't just sit here and complain about stuff that you just can't change. So I'm going to talk about the top 10 current best decks of the format. So in number 10, you guys might actually be surprised. I actually put a tie between Sky Strikers, whew, thank you, Lord Jesus, and Salaman Grades. So these decks are totally, like, literally shells of their former self. But why do I think these decks are so good? They have really good matchups all across the board. So for me right now, the most popular decks are honestly going to be Drytrons, Dinos, Eldlich, any Eldlich variant, Buster Blader variants. I still think Buster Blader is going to be crazy on calling it early versus later. Zoodiac, Dogmatika, Invoked, and Virtual World. Those are like very popular. And I feel like, okay, prank kids are pretty popular too. And so for one, let's talk a little bit about the toolbox of these cards and what makes them so good. So for me already, these decks, their engines are so compact and concise. And they're like, these decks like have so many coherent properties with other tech cards where they can get away with playing them because they don't get in the way of the actual main focus of the deck. Like, they don't overlap into your engine where, like, okay, like, this is just not going to work. I can't main deck this. Because it's like, for example, something I compare it to is when you're playing Ice Dragon's Prison, Nibiru, and Gamma in an Altergeist deck. where your tech cards literally overlap your engine, where you have to pick one or the other. Well, with Salmon-Gate and Sky Strikers, especially decks like Sky Strikers, there's certain tech cards that literally benefit this deck in the terms that it gives it a form of interaction that it desperately needs to out problematic cards. The same can go for Salmon-Gate. So already their engines are very clear and concise in the terms that like you don't really need a lot to get going, and it's very straightforward, and it's not very difficult to learn how to play these decks. So the learning scale is already, it's like mid-range. The learning scale, like the learning curve, I want to say, on these decks is like mid-range. So Salmon-Gate and Sky Strikers have great recovery, great recursion, and in the long run, they can beat a lot of decks because they're able to grind so well, and they can force tempos. When a deck can force tempos, I love it. Whenever a deck can force a tempo, and you can't control it, you have to play into that tempo, it's crazy. So Salmon-Gates, let's talk a little bit about their toolbox. Rage is crazy right now. Rage and Heat Leo are going to be so good this format. Heat Leo alone is amazing. Foxy is crazy. Any deck that has main deck back row removal is going to be so good because there are certain control decks that are going to be top tier, and you have to have a way to contend with the main deck interactions that they have post-siding. Otherwise, your game 1 is never going to be as favorable as your game 2 and 3 because you're not playing the right cards. And for me, Salmon-Gate already has a toolbox that gives it an edge against control in rogue decks. Anybody that plays Salmon-Gates can agree with me. Salad is really good against rogue. And some of the decks that are going to be popular were rogue previously, and the way that they interacted was as a control deck initially. So the toolbox, just Rage, Heat Leo, Foxy, and Foul alone are already so crazy. This deck can set up Baguska, Abyss Dweller. I'm telling you right now, it's going to be one of the best Floodgate rank 4s of the format. It's always been so good. You have access to Roar. You have a constant, and I mean a constant, like basically a circle of life. Every turn, you're going to be able to trigger so many different effects playing out of your graveyard, getting advantage even if you don't have a hand. Sunlight Wolf is a +2 every single turn. This deck can recur Ash Blossom. I can't stress how important that is right now. Being able to loop Ash Blossom, because Ash Blossom is going to be so good against a lot of these, and I mean a lot of these decks right now. And just Rage alone for me is like one of the biggest selling points, because Rage is crazy against Dinos, Rage is crazy against Buster Blader, Rage is crazy against Eldlich, it's crazy against Zoo. Like literally, even though, okay, I understand like Ram could stop Rage's first effect, but his second effect does not target. Rage is crazy against Invoked, Dogmatika, Virtual World. Salmon-Gate Rage is just a really powerful card, okay? Like, that is one of the biggest selling points where I feel like in a format where you can actually play a card like that and you can play it in your comfort zone where you don't have to focus so much on beating combo all the time, where you can play more favorable matchups where your engine is already so good, Salmon-Gate has a huge edge right now. It can outgrind Eldlich. I think like Eldlich's only strength against that deck, in my opinion, if you ask me, is honestly just going to be Walkero and maybe Golden Lord from hand. But Salmon-Gate's engine itself is just so strong against that deck. It's so strong against Zoodiac, and it's so strong against Dogmatika Invoke. It's so strong against Virtual World. Like, sure, it can be less favorable going second, but already alone, I feel like Salmon-Gate have a lot of strengths. Like, I mean a lot. And in Sky Strikers, I feel have a bit more in their toolbox. Their toolbox is way more versatile, and they have a lot more impactful cards that can cover so many matchups. Sky Strikers, I feel like, have just so many good matchups this format. For Shark Cannon and also Widow Anchor's existence alone, there's so many decks that just can't beat that. The fact that you can outgrind Eldlich and banish all their Golden Lords. When you have Widow Anchors, unless they're playing Bunny Blast, which, you know, kudos for them. Multi-roll still denies the negation. Like when you have Widow Anchors for Zoodiacs against Zoodiac Eldlich, when you don't really care about the Buster Blader lockout, like the skill drain-esque effect of it, when you don't really mind playing into a Shizm, Makaba, Flare Delis board, when you don't mind playing into that because you can beat that, when you have access to Afterburners, jamming waves, goodness gracious, when you can main deck Mystic Mine, and oh, this is so big. This deck can main deck There Can Be Only One in Ice Dragon's Prison. Ice Dragon's Prison is such a powerful card right now, and when you can main deck it, and you can play probably the best Floodgate, There Can Be Only One, literally just, it dookies all over PK, Infernoble, Drytron, like all of the Drytrons are machines. And then also Dinos, oh, good luck Dinos. For me, Eldlich, it's huge against Eldlich. Like if you flip it at the right time, they can no longer summon any more zombies. Against Zoodiac, oh Lord Jesus, thank you Lord Jesus. Against Dogmatika Invoke, there can be only one can be really impactful as well. It depends. It's also the timing of when you activate the card. Like, you could flip it at a point where Alistair is up and on board, and it might not be as impactful because they can link him off and summon Ecclesia. But like when you're flipping it when they have their Dogmatikas, it denies the Alistair follow-up, meaning the next turn Alistair can't come out. And against Virtual World, it's decent, but I wouldn't side any Floodgates against that deck just because Chuchi's a card. So unless you're pairing it with the Cosmic Cyclone, it's not going to be that impactful. But just that alone, Sky Strikers is crazy. I think that, like, literally Sky Strikers has such a favorable Drytron matchup because, to be honest, like, okay, for me, VFD is not really going to do much against Sky Strikers. So the only card you really have to worry about would be Herald if they play it. That's if they're on it. Like, if they're on a different variant, I still think Strikers have an edge. Especially, like, if they lose game 1, games 2 and 3 are going to be a lot more favorable for them. I'm not saying they just literally beat Drytrons. I'm not saying that they're better than Drytrons. I think that they have a decent Drytron matchup, a very good Dino matchup, a very good Buster Blader matchup, a very good Eldlich matchup, very good Zoodiac matchup, a very good Dogmatika Invoke matchup. They're decent against Virtual World. And to be honest, this deck's kind of crazy right now. And like, for me, Striker and Salad are definitely taking number 10. Like, without a doubt. Like, one Ray forces so many interactions. The fact that these decks, like Salad and Striker's probably better at trading cards with you, and the point where, like, it can trade one for one and still beat you at the end of it. Like, one Ray, Ray is still such a crazy card. In number 9, I put PK Fire / Burning Abyss / PK. My biggest issue with PK Fire is a lot of people are setting up Opelousas, Fog Blades, and then like one Omni Negate. So I feel like also Evenly Match is going to be so crazy this format because like there's not very many decks that can put up multiple Omni Negates that people are going to see as favorable. Like Infernoble, I don't think they're going anywhere. I'm pretty sure they're here for the long run that until like something happens to the core engine, Infernoble is always going to be popular. Its ceiling's just not going to be as high, but there are certain decks like Salad and Striker and the Mirror Match and Prank Kids and Drytrons and, well, it depends on the variant, and Dinos, unless they give you a Lost World token, which is a different story, and Eldlich, which is crazy, Buster Bladers, Zoos, Dogmatika Invoke, Virtual World. Evenly Matched is crazy against all those. I just really wanted to call that. So my biggest issue with PK Fire is its boards, like its turn 1 boards, struggle a lot against Equalizer cards, and they're not very impactful against every matchup. So like they don't always have favorable matchups just because of how people are building it. For me, if I was going to play PK Fire's competitive, I would play the Kali Yuga route because I know that I have a favorable matchup against everything. At the end of the day, if I can get to my win condition, I win the duel. It's different from VFD. I'm preventing my opponent from activating anything. So whereas some decks like Zoodiacs might not be, or I want to say like a deck like Sky Striker, for example, to be honest, there might not be struggling so much against VFD. When you could set up Kali Yuga, which is also a heavy Storm Duster in general, against any deck, I feel like there's no way to play out of that. Once it hits the field, there's just no way that you can play out of Kali Yuga because you can't play in the first place. It's like a better Zexal, if you ask me, and all you need is one turn with this deck is gas. It can play through so many interruptions, so many hand traps. It has constant recursion. It has an amazing grind game. My biggest issue is just the deck builds themselves, and the inboards for me is just that's not the route I would go for because I want a universal inboard where it's favorable against every matchup versus like 7 monster negates and then I play against control and my negates don't do anything. So with the right build and the right player, I think PK Fire is definitely going to be crazy this format, but we'll see. Speculation is definitely going to play like a huge factor against like on like this entire list that I have because decks can get worse or they can get better in a week. A deck can be so popular and then 2 days from now it could just die out. You just never know. Like this is how Yu-Gi-Oh players are. They're very I guess you could say I just want to say it's like bandwagons. Like there's certain bandwagons that will carry for a longer time, and then there's other times where people just feel like, okay, this deck's just not good enough. But who knows? Like speculation could lead PK Fire to be stronger. Like for example, if it was to top an LCS, Lord have mercy. You know how many PK Fire players are just going to rise from the grave. And then next up in number 8, I put Infernobles. No, this deck's not dead. No, it's not a bad combo deck. Yes, the ceiling is lower. No, it can't play through as many hand traps as it used to be. Yes, it can still force interactions. Yes, it can still play through or around Nibiru. Yes, it can still hand loop you. Yes, it can still gain information off Aqua Dolphin. Yes, it's still a good deck. I don't really want to talk too much about the deck. I know now that it has more choke points than it used to have, and it's more keen to Auradon resolving the Mecha Phantom Beast Link than it was before. That's one of the big choke points, and because it can't set up Herald of the Arclight or Borreload Savage prior to setting up Auradon, it's easier to hand trap the deck, but it's not the end of the world. Like, the deck can still play through them. I'm not going to talk too much about that. In number 7, I put up Prank Kids. I think this deck's crazy. Okay, so for one, out of every, and this is one of the reasons why PK Fire got put over Saladin Strikers, because it's way more consistent. No matter how good a deck is, brother, and this is like for my Pendulum players out there, like, because I'm a Pendulum player too, I understand, you know, I know the deck is really, really powerful, but one of the biggest issues with, like, when you want to play a deck, especially in a competitive event where you know you're going to be playing 9+ rounds, consistency is almost better than power. Almost every single time. So even if a deck has a better toolbox, even if it has a better inboard, even if it has better cards that it can access, sometimes generic, when it can't do that consistently enough, when it leads to brick hands, when every hand's not gas and you can lose to one hand trap, that can be a big problem. So the reason why I feel like Prank Kids already beat every other deck in the consistency department is because you have 18 one-card combos that you can play, and any amount of extenders that can put another prank or monster on the field allow you to play through the Ash, the Gamma, or the Skullmeister. So Ash, Gamma, and Skullmeister can be really impactful in the normal summon, but anybody with the correct build can easily play through those because you already, as a Prank Kid player, know what your choke points are, so you built your deck to beat the cards that normally beat you. So this deck in the right hand is crazy. This deck takes way more skill. For me personally, I think the learning curve on this deck is like just... You can't see it. It's like an invisible line that people just don't see. People just probably don't think this deck takes skill. But it takes a lot to be a good Prank Kid player. But this deck's very rewarding. It's very good with trading card for card with your opponent. It will always beat a playset of Infinite Impermanence with the one-card combo. My build, at least, I can play through 3 Imperms or 3 Veilers or a combination of both. 3 of them with 1 Prank Kid. And for me, when your one-card combo doesn't lose to a single hand trap, that's crazy. Like, yes, it can lose to certain hand traps, but it doesn't lose to every hand trap. And I love that. Cards like Ghost Ogre could be more favorable this format, and they're not good against this deck. There are just certain hand traps that people will main deck that just won't be that good. This deck can play around Nib. You can get a +5 off 1 card. Your recursion, you have the best recursion out of every deck, whether it's Strikers, whether it's Eldlich, the Golden Lord deck, whether it's just Virtual Worlds or Invoked. Like, some decks might have better follow-ups or recovery, but I feel like this deck's, just in general, this deck's, I want to say, because like it's kind of like recovery, but I really want to say this deck's recursion. It's different. Like, recovery is like, sometimes recovery is like when your board gets broken and you could just make it again. But this deck's recursion is like second to none. The amount of cards you can continue to just get from your grave is just ridiculous. This deck can beat you in just just downright advantage. Battle Butler and also Ripper Rooster are good against every single one of the best decks. If you're playing against Dinos, just literally summon Weather Washer, bring out a Doodle and a Bow Wow Bark. If they don't have Pankratops, you make access code next turn and break their board. Whenever I play against Dinos, I just do the Weather Washer play, and that's how I beat them. I don't know why people think Prank Kids suck against Dinos, but anyways, this deck is really, really strong. It's the best deck in time, and to be honest, it's probably going to get even better. Yes, there are certain choke points, but every deck has choke points. That's what you guys have to understand. You can't not play a deck just because of what its weakness is, because then you're going to move on to a deck that might seem more favorable, but it still has weaknesses. A good deck builder or a good duelist just builds their deck to beat their weaknesses. If you know your normal summon loses to a Chuchi, main the Cyclones. You know what I mean? If you know you can't beat Ash, find a way to chain block. Play Parallel Exceed. If you know that you can't play past your normal summon, play Extenders. Don't play 20+ hand traps. So it's similar to PK Fire, where you need a good build and you need a good player, because not everybody's going to do good with this deck. But in the right hands, this deck can beat every deck, like literally every single deck. Like, I don't know how Zoodiacs can play out of double Raigeki. I don't know how Eldlich can play out of double Rip Run Rooster. I don't know how any deck like Striker or Salad or PK Fire or Infernoble or just like Dino is probably the only one that has an advantage just with miscellaneous source, but there's just a lot of decks that just can't play out of what Prank Kids can set up, and that's excluding the amount of hand traps and tech cards this deck can play, because some people will play one card combo build, and that's where cards like Book of Moon, Droplets, Ice Dragon's Prison. You can main There Can Be Only One and Skill Drain. There are strengths this deck has that other decks just don't have. In number 6, I put Drytrons. This deck, I feel like it has a lot of untapped potential. I feel like it can only get better from this point. So this deck is not solved. So when I say it's not solved, I mean like, okay, how do I explain it in better terms? As good as the deck is, this is not its max capacity on like its potential. It can do a lot more, and it probably will do a lot more in the future. But just with the kind of blueprint or practice builds that I've seen, like where people are still kind of like figuring it out, like trying to solve what the deck can and can't do, brother. Even without VFD, this deck is crazy. This deck is really, really good at playing out of situations, playing through interruptions, playing through hand traps. Its inboards are ridiculously good. It's probably out of all decks on this list, it's the most degenerate because, yeah, Virtual Worlds can set up VFD, but this deck can set up VFD. It can set up my favorite boss monster, Herald of Perfection. This deck can also skip your turn, lock you out of monster effects, lock you out of activating spells, and it can also summon Chaos Max on your opponent's turn, which, again, this deck is probably the most degenerate out of every deck on this list. And just for that alone, you could put it in number 1, but also I feel like the number 1 spot should go to something that's a bit more tried and true and something that where you know it's more solved. So again, Drytrons could end up being the best deck. I'm just going to say that now just in case because I do feel like this deck could easily take like the spot where Infernoble and Dragon Link were in the terms of ceiling and degeneracy. Drytron could fill that void for a lot of our degenerate players. They might flock to that. Like basically an Infernoble player that wants to rip your whole hand apart and not let you give a chance to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Might flock to Drytron because it has that aspect where it's not going to let you play if it gets the right setup. But I don't know if this deck can play as many hand traps or flex spot, if it just has as many flex spot as other decks do. And then coming to the top 5, at number 5, I put Dinos. I think this deck is crazy. It's obviously gas. There's so many ways that you can play it. There's so many inboards. There's still like the barrier statue lock. There's still going to be Dogmatika variants. There's still pure. There's still Mystic Mine. Obviously, that card is Cancer. But I just feel like Dinos aren't that good against decks like, for example, okay, so this is where Dinos can struggle. Dinos can struggle against control decks. Any deck that can literally activate traps in a phase that's not the main phase can just like, in any deck that can main Ice Dragon, like Ice Dragon's Prison has like one of the highest impacts in this particular deck than it does against other decks. And this deck, obviously, it's really, really good, but I feel like it struggles against trap decks, and I know that any good Dino player understands that. Like, Lost World does give you an advantage on their targeting, against other targeting effects like Imperm and, you know, Dogmatika Punishment. But this deck, like, it does struggle against control decks. Like, Dinos can easily get checked by Dogmatika Invoked, just literally by Winda. And without having Lost World protection, Dogmatika Punishment is still crazy. And also, in addition to that, I do think that, like, if I didn't talk about it already, I think that Buster Blader and Eldlich, which are more control decks, have a very favorable Dino matchup. A very, very, very favorable. Like, it's just ridiculous how good their matchup will be against Dinos. Dinos will be fighting an uphill battle, like, every time. But obviously, it's number 5. I don't want to talk too much about it. It's been around for a long time. In number 4, I have another tie being any Eldlich variant and any Buster Blader variant. So, there's a lot of Eldlich variants. There's, like, anywhere between Zoo, Eldlich, Infernoble, Invoked Eldlich. You could be playing Dogmatika Eldlich, and to be honest, like when I get to Dogmatika Invoked, I wanted to include just Dogmatika variants, but to be honest, I think the best variant is Dogmatika Invoked, the best Dogmatika variant, not Dogmatika Eldlich, but any Eldlich variant I think is going to do really good. And it's amazing how Eldlich kind of fell out of favor, but now it just becomes more favorable, because the reason, I feel like one of the main reasons why Eldlich fell out of favor was, for one, there were combo decks like Infernoble and Dragon Link that put up Herald of the Arclight, which denied you one of your best spot removals, made it an uphill battle anytime you're playing, and found a way to take the best cards out of your hand. It's sure it had a more favorable Dragon Link matchup because it doesn't need its extra deck to an extent. But if you were playing a variant that needed this extra deck, you would also struggle against the Buster Lock. But I feel like with those decks not being able to summon Herald of the Arclight as consistently and not being able to look at your hand and take your best cards, I feel like trap decks in general can shine a bit more, because there's not like literally like just a plethora of like 5+ combo decks that set up so many Omni Negates that you won't get a chance to even play. I feel like this format is a really good format right now for mid-range and control decks, and Eldlich is arguably the best trap deck just in the game. So I feel like Eldlich is just crazy. Golden Lords is just a really, really strong card. It can force out multiple interruptions by itself. There's so many ways that you can play Eldlich. It's just crazy. That's why I say Eldlich. I'll just say Eldlich and friends, Golden Lord and his friends, and then Buster Blader. The reason why I think this deck is really, really good is because not only do you have a win condition in itself being the skill drain lock, but you can also play the Eldlich cards to give you a more favorable matchup against control decks. So like you have the aspect of locking out combo or monster mash decks and then being able to beat control decks in the grind game and having consistent interruptions against control decks. So I think the best Buster Blader variant would probably be Eldlich with a small, just a hint of salt and pepper on the Dogmatika part, because the Dogmatika cards help you to achieve your end goal and your win condition. But I feel like Eldlich Buster Blader is probably going to be one of the best Eldlich variants. Zoo Eldlich is crazy too, which that's something that we could talk about. But if you ask me, for me personally, I just think Buster Blader Eldlich is just better. Like, I know that Zoo is like a 1-card combo deck. I know that it has more consistency and it has more favorable matchups because like one Zoo, right now in the format that we're in, one Zoodiac monster can out anywhere between 2 to 3 interruptions by itself. So like you're definitely like, it does have strengths. Like, and that's the thing, like Buster Blader and Zoo Eldlich have strengths that one doesn't have and the other might have. And I feel like their normal summons can be a choke point, but I think the end goal and the win condition that Buster Blader Eldlich has is just stronger. And being able to play the Dogmatika cards to also help you to supplement for your consistency, because you're not always going to be able to get a dragon in your graveyard at the end of the day, and that's where the deck can struggle. So if you ask me, Zoo Eldlich is more consistent, but Buster Blader Eldlich is just more powerful, and it's not literally like a brick fest. Like it doesn't have as many ways to get into its win condition as Zoo does. So Zoo Eldlich is obviously going to be the more favorable one. Speaking of, in number 3, I put Zoodiac in all variants between Tri-Brigade, Eldlich, Pure, Dogmatika, whatever your flavor is. It's amazing that this deck is so like it's like watered down to me, like, and not in a bad way. Like, just hear me out. I feel like Zoo is so watered down in the aspect that like there's no Broad Bull, Drytron's only at 1, Rat is at 1, and you mean to tell me that this deck is still that good? It reminds me like what I mentioned earlier in the number 10 when I was talking about Sky Strikers and Salad. Like, imagine if Striker, Salad, and Zoodiac had all of their cards. I feel like they would be the best decks just for the simple fact that they can play so many hand traps and tech cards, and they can build their deck to beat the other decks. Like decks like those where they have the 1-card combo and they have resiliency and they have recovery, they have a lot more room to build their deck to be interchangeable in formats where they can build it to beat certain decks and build it to beat other decks. Like it's really crazy like how many different ways you can build Zoo, Striker, and Salad. And honestly, like if Zoo was at full power and Striker was at full power and Salad was at full power, I think even if Infernoble and Dragon Link never lost any of their cards, Zoo, Salad, and Striker would be like some of the best decks right now. They're just, for me, like they're crazy. Like Zoodiac is amazing right now. Like there's not much to talk about because it's been around for so long, but I just feel like this deck is just so good. It's ridiculous. And funny enough, it's more fragile than a lot of the other decks on this list. Like it's normal summon being interrupted by like a Book of Moon, a Heretic Dragon of Heavenly Spheres. It can just end its turn, but funny enough, people just find a way to combat it. Just like if Sky Striker struggled against like Imperial Order or Anti-Spell, you build your deck to beat what you know it struggles against. And that's where a good Zoodiac player would do really good. Zoo is just so good against combo. Where it struggles against control, that's where the Eldlich aspect will come in to help you to combat those kind of decks. So I feel like Zoo Eldlich is probably going to be the most favorable and probably the most popular. And then Dogmatika Invoke comes in number 2. This deck is probably, if you ask me, it's arguably the best mid-range deck right now because it also has multiple win conditions, which is kind of crazy. Like the Invoke engine is so good. And also like Winda is a really, really strong card, and the fact that this deck can consistently access it is just like, it's amazing. So like for me, I feel like Dogmatika Invoke is better than Zoodiac's, and I feel like they have more representation and they've had more like popularity and tops Zoodiac kind of just it started to like reach like a point where, okay, like like you have to side for it, you have to prepare for it, you can't just ignore the Zoodiac's existence anymore. But Dogmatika Invoke, I just feel like it's just a better control deck of the format. It's a better mid-range deck. Eldlich is really good too, but like Dogmatika Invoke is crazy against control. It's good against combo. You have cards that out, and that's another thing. Like you want to make sure that you can consistently out cards like Dragoon. Dogmatika Invoke has outs to Mega Clops, which is something I forgot to mention that Zoos have. Like they do have access to Mega Clops, which is another strength that a lot of decks don't have. But I feel like just Makaba, Aguadis, Purgatrio is really broken right now. Elysium, if they're on it. Cards like Winda, the Schism, the Schism play is just so good. Dogmatika Punishment, Fleur de Lis, like these cards are really good against everything right now. And you have consistent recovery and follow-ups. And I just feel like when your deck has that much synergy and you can still, very similar to Salad, Strikers, and Zoos, where you can still play so many hand traps and tech cards where it doesn't get in the way of like your main engine, and it doesn't like you don't have to cut consistency cards for tech cards. You can play all the consistency cards that you want, main deck all the tech cards that like you feel like you need, and you still can have a 40 card deck, a 39 card deck if you want, and it has favorable matchups against like so many different decks right now. Like the fact that you can play through so many interruptions. This deck just doesn't care about Drytron pop. This deck can definitely do really it's like very favorable right now. It can do really well against a lot of decks. I think the Dogmatika cards are just so crazy right now. I think Dogmatika Invoked is honestly like just, it's so gas. Like it could break Dragon Link boards if they didn't have the Buster Lock. It could break through Infernoble boards. Like it's crazy how the Invoke engine is so good going first or second, and the Dogmatika engine is so good going first or second. Like that alone is just really strong when both your engines can do that. Because with Eldlich, one of the issues with Eldlich is sometimes it's not as good. Golden Lord is probably the only way Eldlich can break boards going second. So like you basically have your normal summon plus a cursed. But like Dogmatika Invoke has so many ways to pick boards apart and remake its own. And also one of its biggest strengths that it has over every deck right now that I mentioned was Winda. Winda's just so good. Like Winda with protection. And then the number one, I picked Virtual Worlds. So for me, Virtual Worlds is the embodiment of a mid-range / control deck and a combo deck. It can set up VFD, Chuchi. Shinshin is just so crazy. Shinshin alone like is a win condition. The fact that this deck can play through so many hand traps like Nibiru. I think cards like Ash, Gamma, and Ghost Bell might become more popular if this deck continues to stay where it's at. But I feel like this is just the best deck. I don't want to talk too much about it. I just think Virtual World is crazy. I play this deck myself. And I really think that it's probably going to be the best deck. And if not, it's going to be probably one of the most represented. It's so favorable right now. It does have its own weaknesses. Its weaknesses are very similar to like Zoos, where if you remove the card, it can be it can be a detriment to it. But like this deck just shines in so many areas. And I think this is the best deck personally. For me. And that's pretty much the end of the video, you guys. God bless you guys. I'm going to say a quick prayer. I don't really have honorable mentions. I do, I guess, Herald and Shadal, but I didn't want to do too many because I know people can complain about me not shouting out their deck, so I just didn't even want to go there. So I figured, don't shout anything out so then people don't, even, press you about it. Anyways, our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, Lord Jesus Christ. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done on earth just as it is in heaven. Lord, please give us this day our daily bread, and please forgive us of our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not to temptation, Father, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the glory, and the power forever. In the mighty name of Jesus Christ, Yeshua, I pray. Thank you, Father. Amen. All right. Deuces.